All right, so our landscape project, this panoramic project, let me get to the exposures. Our first step is to tile up our exposures together in a believable way. And then from all of those different overlapping photos, we will crop to the composition we want to use. And then we will color process it as a whole. So the first step, of course, is bringing our exposures in so we can even see them. So I've been working on pass 1, which takes a lot of these photos, not all of them because some of them are redundant, are too close to each other, you don't really need them. And then I'll do the technique again on pass 2, which I think is going to be better because it's a slightly better vantage point. This one was handheld instead of tripod secured, but it was bright enough, it shouldn't matter too much. So when I brought them in, so I'll be repeating this whole process again, I brought them in as smart objects onto one canvas. And here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different exposures that I now need to tile together to make into one continuous image. And first I just placed them simply. And now I'm going through layer by layer and finding the exact point at which I seam them together and have one show and have the other drop out. And you want that to be a defined point. So all or nothing, like that. And the reason you want that is so that you don't get this happening. This kind of blurry ghosting where you have parts of each exposure showing. And to avoid that, where everything gets soft and kind of muddled. So to avoid that, we don't blend with a low opacity eraser. Instead, we just try as much as we can to find a seam where it's all or nothing. A nice clear edge. All right. So let me build that with my other pass, just so we can start from the beginning now that you have exposures. So when I brought them into my computer, let's see. When I brought them into my computer, I first arranged them into 2 folders. Pass 1, which went left to right, and pass 2, which went right to left. So now this pass is the one I'll be using, and if I open them up in preview, I could kind of see that the exposures have good focus. I like the gradation and the clarity of the sky. It's better that they're a little bit too dark as opposed to too light, because that gives me more options. That makes it a more balanced exposure. And I can always test that just to see the lighting tools within Preview, this very simple program. And you can see if I brighten up the midtones, there's still quite a bit of texture in the leaves and in the branches, even though they're backlit, that comes through. I also have a little bit of directional light. You can see the sun is out here. I didn't shoot the sun in the frame because it's getting quite bright, but you can see the shadows, and that's going to give me some movement as well. And I have this body of water glistening in the background, which gives it some nice depth. Whoops. Let's see. Hopefully I didn't change that exposure without meaning to. It looks like I did. Be careful with Preview now, because this newest version of Preview, it saves automatically when you make a change if you don't reset it. But that's why I always have things in 2 places when I'm processing. So remember, I keep my memory card pristine. I don't save anything else to my memory card, so I can always go back to it and get my raw exposures, should I need to. And in this case, I need to, so that, and I'm also leaving the numbers. These numbers are going to help. So I want 944 right here. And I will replace it with the one before I messed with it. Now, how do you mess with it in preview and not overwrite it? You just go to Adjust Color Tools, you play with it, you kind of see what potential it has as an exposure, and then you just say Reset All before you close it, and then it won't overwrite it. Used to be it would always ask if you wanted to save it, but this new version doesn't. All right, so now that you have your paths, it's good to arrange them in different folders because we're going to do things where we select them later. I want to know which direction I'm going. So in this case, I'm going right to left, and I'm going to open up my first exposure in Photoshop. And now I need to grow the canvas size behind it with enough room to accommodate all the other exposures. So I go to Image, Canvas Size, and this time I'm going to grow off to the left. So this is where my original exposure is, and I want to grow space off to the left with an extension color of white. And so if the width of my exposure is 13 inches, I want to go maybe 6 or 7 times that. So let's do 70 inches, maybe 75 inches. I'm also going to grow the height a little bit on the top and bottom because the exposures will tend to travel up or down. So I'm going to make it 12 inches tall, growing both above it and below it. Okay, and then I can hit Command 0 to fit it all on screen, and there you see my canvas. Now I need to bring in my other exposures, and I do them in order. So if that's 944, now I bring in 945. And it will come in as a new layer on top of my last one. And I can just roughly place them and hit return. Next one, 946, roughly place. And I'm looking to overlap by about a third, somewhere between a third and a half for each one. And you hit return to place them. But this is just rough for the moment. And you see how it's kind of stacking them up here. Hit return. It will also name the layer by bringing them in this way. It will name the layer after the image file name, which is handy. So that's 947, now 948. Now 949. You only need 5 pictures, but having more allows you more options, you hope. And 950. More options for an interesting composition. And finally 951. Now this was about 180 degrees. But I liked kind of the curve of this path, winding back to this stream back here. So that gives me a good indication of what the setup is. I also really like the linear perspective of these clouds and how that looks like a lot of depth, and how this path winds back into the corners. So I think this has a lot of potential. And probably more potential than my other one did because of the slightly different viewpoint. Notice how low the horizon is at the corners and then how that mounds up with this little hill. I think that's a little bit more interesting. I do kind of wish there wasn't that lamppost in the middle, but you do what you do when you are on campus. Okay, now it's all in one Photoshop file. I'm going to turn off all the layers except for the first one. And then I'm going to turn on the first layer that overlaps, and I'm going to right-click it and say rasterize. And that allows me to edit it. And now I'm going to say File, Save As, Carl, assignment, is it 5? Panoramic. So let me make sure it's assignment 5. I have them all so nicely organized. Yes, indeed, assignment 5, the panoramic landscape. And I'm going to save it to the desktop as a PSD because I'm still working on it. Okay, now the goal is to not just roughly put them together, but to really purposefully put them together. And this is what takes some skill. And the first thing I do is I take the layer that's on top and I take it down to 50% opacity. And I use my guides with the move tool to find the edge of it. And that way I can see what range I have. And for this photo, I overlapped it by over half. I overlapped it by about 60%. So I have plenty of space, but the ideal place to find a point of convergence is in the last third of the frame. And that's where kind of the different cone of visions from each shot will line up the best. Now this is tricky because my tree extends beyond that. So ideally, I want to go right beyond the edges of this tree so I can use all of that tree from one. I'm trying to think the best way to do that. Might be to line up something over on this side, a little bit closer to the edge. Maybe even right on the path there. The perfect thing to line up would be these lights. And I can do it. I'll show you how. So if I line up that light pole, you'll notice that everything kind of goes in sync right up along that light pole, except for the tree, because trees tend to move, especially foreground versus background. So now, and that's about halfway in the overlap, and it's on the third of the first exposure. So that's the good place to do it. Now what I do is I draw with my lasso tool where I want to cut it. And I'm going to be cutting this layer. Let's see. And I'm basically going to cut around the tree branches, see if I can get away with that. And then I'm going to cut down the pole and then just through the empty grass like so. And I have to remember what side I'm on. I want to cut away this side and then just hit delete. Okay? Then I can take its opacity back up to 100 and see what I need to do to kind of blend that seam in. So the sky is pretty odd, right? Because clouds move in the sky. So I'll transition those with my eraser, but all of this looks pretty good. See, by finding that transition right there, it cleanly shows me the trees and the grass, and everything looks perfectly sharp and clean. We only get an indication that there's different exposures at the bottom and different repeats. All right. Because the